Welcome to FO Live. With me are two of Fair Observer's most distinguished authors, Gary Grappo, who's our board member, our former chair, is a retired US ambassador. He was in the office of the Peace Quartet at Jerusalem in his last posting in the US State Department. He is an expert on international relations, world affairs, foreign policy, and an eminent author in more ways than one. We also have with us Glenn Carle, my partner in crime. We do the podcast, The Dialectic. Our last one was on Iran, and thank you very much for your wonderful feedback on that podcast. We also do FO Exclusive, our take on the top issues of the month, on the last Wednesday of the month. And Glenn is the author of The Interrogator. He is obviously a geopolitical guru. He's a senior partner at FOI, a geopolitical risk advisory. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a double treat. And in this FO Live, we are discussing Donald Trump's two summits of uncertainty. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Atul, always happy to be with you.
Thank you, sirs. Now, we'll have a three-part structure. We are going to discuss, number one, the Anchorage, Alaska Summit. Number two, the Washington, D.C. Summit. And number three, what lies ahead? What next? So, gentlemen, if I may, what are your takeaways of the Anchorage, Alaska Summit, the Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump powwow?
Glenn, if you want to go first.
Okay, I'll give it a go. Well, I have said for many years that Donald Trump has some, at the very least, bizarre relationship with the Russian government. I've gone so far as to say that I thought he was I believe he was a de facto, if not a witting, asset. Certainly, there's no question he was manipulated and targeted by the Russian intelligence. Whether that is true or not, he has almost literally repeated verbatim when the talking points issued by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Russian intelligence services, whenever he speaks about a foreign policy issue, that's almost a literally true statement. So whether it's the alignment of the stars, ideological affinity, or just aping words he hears to fill empty spaces, those are facts. So the Alaska Summit was really a triumph for Vladimir Putin, Russian policy. What happened was that he was literally allowed out of the containment that he has been held in, the pariah status he's been held in since even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but in particular since then. He has had a visit with the most powerful country in the world, the one that was leading the sanctions and the efforts to stop Russia's invasion of Ukraine and to enable Ukraine to defend itself and survive. So from top to bottom, the entire event was really a success for Russia. The tough talk that the media believed it had discerned in Trump's comments in the run to the Anchorage meeting was talk, and talk, we all know how much talk costs. I think it was tactical posturing to sound good. It might have been partially sincere on the part of Donald Trump also to try to get some leverage so he could have his piece and go give his speech in Oslo as a Nobel laureate. But that's what happened, really, at least on a diplomatic level, which is significant. It was a success for Russia, and the United States obtained zero. Donald Trump I think, obtained what he wanted, which was a summit to be the center of attention, to rehabilitate Vladimir Putin in Russia. And that's what it amounted to. It left Europe on the sidelines, Ukraine helpless about its own fate, and it was all of the catastrophic things that critics have said.
I certainly agree with much of what Glenn has said. A few additional comments I would have further to Glenn's point about the odd relationship between Putin and Trump. What initially struck me was a bizarre, uncanny, and certainly inappropriate, in the case of an American president, solicitous treatment by Trump of Putin. Almost as though he were a handler of Putin, that just the way he greeted him, the red carpet, waiting on that red carpet. And Putin kept him waiting, by the way, kept him waiting. First in Trump's Air Force One, and then subsequently on the tarmac on that red carpet. That is a notorious diplomatic stunt, and I've seen it pulled before. And it's usually, in fact, it's always done intentionally for a reason. And the reason in this case was to show who's the top dog. And just the way he was greeted by Trump was shocking to me, for an American president to go out of his way to greet Putin the way he did. I would also say, if you study...
the symbolism matters here, Gary. What you're saying, the symbolism matters.
Is extremely important because this is what is used to portray this encounter back in Russia.
So Vladimir Putin, just to interrupt, Vladimir Putin made a power move.
Oh, it was very clearly a power move. And if you look at Putin's body language as he strolled off the airplane, as he greeted Trump, as the two of them walked along the red carpet, it showed to me all the evidence of someone who knew he was in control. Now, and Glenn will know this, Trump is I don't know what the actual term is, but I know he's a very high black belt in judo. Judo is a very physical...
Putin, you mean, not Trump. Putin is a high black belt.
Putin. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know what level he is, but I know he's a black belt, and he's very proud of that. He's been a judo martial arts person for some time. And, you know, in a combat sport like that, it very much involves portraying yourself in a certain way, particularly as you confront the competition, your adversary. And he's used those skills, and he uses them very effectively. And you could see that in his body language, in the way he greeted Trump, in the way the two of them walked in his press conference, the way he looked, the way he held himself, all portrayed someone who controlled the environment, controlled the meeting, controlled the encounter. And that's important because when they got into the meeting, and I know a little bit about how Putin conducts meetings, although I've never met with the man, and maybe Glenn can speak to this, given Putin's background as a former intelligence officer, but Putin tends to speak first, which he did, and for a very long time, without allowing the other person to speak, not even to interrupt, even to ask for a clarification. And so I'm sure that is what he did. And with the intention of demonstrating to Donald Trump that what Putin wants, actually is a better approach to achieving what Donald Trump wants. That is to incorporate the objectives of Donald Trump and make it seem as though, Donald, I'm helping you out. I'm giving you what you want. Use my plan, which is why, in the end, Trump dropped his insistence on a ceasefire despite the fact this is what Zelenskyy has wanted and what all the European leaders have wanted for some time now. That's been their insistence. All of a sudden now he's on the Putin page, and no, he wants an once and for all peace plan. And anyone who understands, who has negotiated a peace plan before, knows that those things, which I have, those things do not happen quickly. And Donald Trump wants a quick victory. And if he wants a peace plan, he's not going to get it if he wants it very quickly, because there are just too many details. And I will also say as an aside, I don't believe his negotiating team has the experiential heft, the juice, as American athletes often say, to actually deliver the goods for a genuine peace plan that satisfies the interest of the parties, and in our particular case, the United States, but especially Ukraine. And all of this, to me, became evident as they came out of Anchorage, and Trump effectively conceded, surrendering the ceasefire in his remarks. And of course, what does Putin do? Number one, he says, it was a great meeting. My friend, he says all these wonderful, nice things, which we all know Trump likes to hear. He is very susceptible to those kinds of platitudes. And the other thing he threw out wasn't necessary, but of course Trump just went off on it, and that was you actually did win the 2020 election because we weren't tampering with it. You are the winner. It was an honest victory. And number two, I would not have invaded Ukraine if you had been the president. That's just a throwaway. We know that's not true. He probably would have. In fact, I think he definitely would have. And it would have gotten away with a lot more, because how the U.S. responded with Biden as president is clearly not the way Donald Trump would have responded. And so when all was said and done, Trump left with very, very little. I mean, a few scraps. And as one Russian media commentator put it, it was a total victory for Russia and for Putin, and we gave away nothing. Vladimir Putin is the new Tsar Alexander III. That's a practically verbatim quote from this Russian journalist. So Anchorage was not a good experience for, well, most importantly, Ukraine, but not for the United States.
Yeah. Atul, before you carry on, 3 points, if I can remember them quickly. One, as an intelligence officer, I can tell you that Donald Trump is the easiest target, which is the term we use, to manipulate that I've ever seen, other than perhaps a 3-year-old child who likes lollipops. And I've recruited many of those. Astoundingly easy to manipulate. Modi knows this, Macron knows this, Mohammed bin Salman knows this, Putin knows this. What you do is you flatter the guy, you praise him. Exactly what Gary was saying is what Putin did. But he's also an impossible person to control. The ideal, the objective for an intelligence officer with an asset, once a target is recruited, he's then an asset, is you have to control. You always insist on control. And if you can't convince headquarters that you're controlling your asset, then you will be in trouble, because something that's not controlled in intelligence is very dangerous. And he's impossible to control. But you can still, at arm's length, manipulate him, as the Russians have done, have done for literally 46 years, I think it is, unless it's 49. Doesn't matter. So one, there's that aspect of the dynamic that is so obviously at play. The second thing is, all of us, the three of us here talking, All of the media people who interview me, all the pundits talking, we all make the mistake of trying to take seriously a substantive point or objective, what's going on in foreign policy with regard to Donald Trump and Russia and Ukraine and any other subject. And all of those things are secondary, really. What counts, what drives Donald Trump is his sense of himself, which gets back to the first point. So he has no real philosophy. He's an isolationist. He's an authoritarian. He respects and he believes he understands the dynamics of someone telling somebody else what to do and imposing his will. Thus his affinity for Putin, bin Salman, Erdogan, the Brazilian leader, on and on and on. And democracy's messy, and there are counter arguments and compromise and inefficiencies that he doesn't understand. So to that extent, he actually has some sort of conviction, if that counts as a conviction. But beyond that, really, all that counts is what in a given moment makes him feel that he is the center of attention and can claim success. And the facts are irrelevant to that. In truth, they're irrelevant because so long as you assert something, then it can become the truth. So therefore, he went in with no particular objective except to look good. And Putin said, here's how things have to be. And he doesn't care about the security of Ukraine or Central Europe or NATO alliances whatsoever. He cares that he stopped the fighting. And the way to stop the fighting can be done most simply by imposing Russia's will, because the other stuff involves more death and sending money and who knows what's going on. That's all that was. That's it that was in the mind and the strategic quote unquote objectives of Donald Trump, ergo the United States. And all of us trying to think, oh well, he made a few concessions or he got a few concessions. All of these things really, I'm not being facetious and I'm not being derogatory just because I am hostile to the person's policies. That's the dynamic that underpins or underlays what happened at Anchorage and what happened before and what happened yesterday in the White House, and that's it. The rest of us are spinning our wheels like academics, detached from reality. The reality is in between Donald Trump's ears.
All right. We've talked a little bit about the Anchorage Alaska Summit, and both of you concur that the US got nothing out of it. Vladimir Putin emerged as a winner. He's Tsar Alexander III now.
But Donald Trump emerged as a winner in Donald Trump's mind because he was the center of attention and is driving international events. He doesn't care which direction he drives them, but he's driving international events. So it was a success, and his anger and resentment at all of us for saying, well, this didn't go very well, is sincere. Because he says, you don't understand. I mean, look what I did. And he achieved what he wanted to do.
And he was able to, and it's not difficult, all the sycophants who worked in his staff, his cabinet, and everyone praised him to the nines, starting with Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Rubio ought to be smart enough to observe that the United States got nothing out of that summit. But he portrayed in a Fox interview that he gave subsequently, I think it was the day after, this as just an incredible success, a breakthrough. Some of the Republicans in Congress said that this was a threshold event. And of course, it was anything but, well, a threshold in the sense that it seems as though Trump just jettisoned all the tough and right positions he had taken and is back to where he was before, which is speaking the talking points of Putin or the Russian media. And of course, that all is very appeasing to the ego of Donald Trump. But moving on to
Let's get to the second part, okay? The second part, we are recording this, and I'll tell you what time we are recording it. We're recording it, it's almost coming to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Tuesday, July 19th. Oh, not July, August 19th. My apologies. So Tuesday, August 19th, nearly 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And so we've had a second summit in Washington. European leaders have flown along with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. I have been interacting with a number of press people who have been coming from the White House straight from covering these leaders to grab drinks and drown their sorrows or to regale us with tales. And some of the tales are most entertaining. But I'm going to leave it to the two experts we have here to opine and tell you journalistic first-hand tales later. So what do you think of the Washington, D.C. summit? What does this signify?
I think at the very conclusion of the summit in Alaska, there was no set plan for Trump to immediately meet with Zelenskyy, although apparently he did telephone him. And I think that's when Zelenskyy realized, because he was getting readouts of Anchorage, that he needed to see the president. Because one of the many characteristics of Donald Trump is what is uppermost on his mind is whatever the last person he saw told him. And of course, the last person was Putin. And so Zelenskyy realized he needed to get in there and personally, even potentially subjecting himself to another mauling session that he experienced back in February. And therefore, effectively imposed himself on the president. I want to come and see you. I need to talk about this, which is a wise thing to do. He needed to do that. And apparently simultaneously, and this is where my understanding is a little fuzzy, the European leaders, apparently led by Macron, the president of France, came around to the view that they needed to be there too. And there's clearly was communication between them and Zelenskyy. And that was also a very smart idea. Zelenskyy needed to have that backing when he went back to the White House if he was ever going to confront the situation he experienced back in February in the Oval Office.
Let's very quickly remind our viewers that when Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited the White House, J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, acted as the attack dog and mauled him for not being grateful enough. It was a confrontation, and relations between Ukraine and the U.S. declined, between the White House and the Ukrainian president's office declined. And there was real worry in European capitals in the immediate aftermath. Over to you, Gary.
Yes, and in that session, I mean, the worst of it was that Vance, and backed up by Trump, effectively told Zelenskyy, you need to capitulate. That's the only way you're going to end this war. You need to give Putin what he wants, and then the war will end, you'll have peace. Now, a lot transpired since then. And I actually did not think that we would see a reprise of what we saw in February. And thankfully, I think the European leaders being present was helpful in that respect. And once again, we saw a bit of vacillation on the part of Trump, that he'd been told one thing by Putin, and now this was uppermost in his mind: no ceasefire, no reimposition of sanctions, no ratcheting up of any other penalties. And then now he's talking about, he's still on the ceasefire kick, but he's now talking about almost forcing or imposing this tripartite summit that would include himself, Putin, and Zelenskyy, because that was not at all clear from Anchorage, not at all clear. And
will it be in Moscow, as Vladimir Putin suggested in his parting shot?
Yes, there was that too up in Anchorage.
You missed out on that, Gary. We'll meet in Moscow.
Yes, meeting in Moscow. So, nevertheless, But I thought what was most interesting is that he did seem to sort of backstep a bit on the territorial concessions that he said in his press release. He didn't have to say those after Anchorage, but he did, which I think probably was really sent chills down the spine of Zelenskyy and the spines of Zelenskyy and the European leaders. Territorial concessions. I'm not sure that was the exact wording that he used. And so now what I think we see is a very unclear situation. Another component of the White House confab was some suggestion that, in fact, the United States, agrees there needs to be security guarantees for Ukraine. That's critically important, very important. Number two, that the U.S. would participate. Unclear how. Unclear how. Today, there was a statement from the White House press office that if there were a peacekeeping mission, the U.S. might participate, including the offer of aviation assets in some form or another. That's pretty shocking to me. Nevertheless, important if true, and we can't be ever certain of that unless it comes from the mouth of Donald Trump, and then it's only true for a short period of time until it's not true. And so all that is to say, once again, that we have a very muddied and unclear, uncertain situation, but better than post-Anchorage, in my view.
So Washington, D.C. summit, sorry to interrupt, Washington, D.C. summit was damage control.
Well, that's what it turned out to be. I don't know if that was their intention or not. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was not, because I don't think they'd be ever willing to admit that there was any damage that needed to be repaired.
Right. Certainly no damage control from the perspective of the United States, which means Donald Trump. However, absolutely damage control from the perspective of everyone else outside of Russia. I think the Washington Summit, if we'll call it that, took us from the jaws of a definitive catastrophe, a cataclysmic situation, which would have been the progressive end of Ukraine, the end of NATO, the absorption of Central Europe much more rapidly or clearly likely than before, to what is now a crisis of dramatic proportions that has a number of directions in which it could move towards resolution of some sort. So in that sense, it was a wonderful result to go from death to grave illness, I suppose. But that's what.
So from death to fourth stage cancer.
Yes, yeah. It's better to be alive than dead in most cases, and at least the prospect of some way forward is alive. And a couple of, well, not that this will inflate me far more than is I merit, but I've said to a number of governments, they say, well, what's going on in the White House? What should you do? What should we do? And my advice is hold America as close as you can to yourself and don't trust us for 1 second. You have to count on only yourself. I think that's true. I'm very, very much a student of de Gaulle in that regard. And, but this is certainly the case under Donald Trump. You can only count on yourself. So the relevance of that perspective, I think, in this moment, is that fortunately for Ukraine, Europe actually is capable, with some effort, of keeping Ukraine independent, providing it enough protection and security, materiel, and money that it can hold off the Russian hordes. And I think and they're scrambling to be able to do that, which will be a first in European history. Well, at least since Genghis Khan, which was a dramatic failure, which was a cataclysm for Europe also. But
for Russia, not for Europe.
Well, only because Genghis Khan died, or Kublai Khan, whichever Khan it was, died,
Genghis.
and Genghis, and they decided that Europe was so backward that it wasn't worth the 2 weeks it would have taken them to conquer it. And they turned around and went back to fight dynastic, issues. Otherwise, Europe would have been far different than it is today. But anyway, the Europeans can do this and are struggling with more success than I had feared to fill in the gap. And Zelenskyy and the Europeans should everything they can get from the United States. They absolutely should get, but I wouldn't believe it beyond the second that it occurs, because the next second it might not.
So let me ask both of you what you think about the observations of journalists who were in the White House. Because one of the things that European journalists in particular talked about was the apparel Vladimir Zelenskyy was wearing. They thought that wearing all black and sitting with the chair at an angle was a little too cocky, a little too unnecessary, a little too brash. Secondly, they made the point that apart from Giorgia Meloni, every European leader is skating on thin ice. Emmanuel Macron has barely 30% popularity. He's in his second term. He's going to go soon. No one likes him. He struggled to get a budget through. He has a government headed by his opponent as prime minister. There's talk of replacing Keir Starmer. Friedrich Merz, by all accounts, a successful corporate lawyer, is struggling to be popular within his own party and struggled to win the first vote of confidence. So their point was that apart from Giorgia, and Gary is in Italy, so he's living in Giorgia Meloni land. Apart from Giorgia Meloni, and no, Giorgia Meloni called Donald Trump Donald before calling him Mr. President. Not that Donald disliked it too much. I suppose she's the most attractive of all European leaders.
She can get away with it because she's a female.
Yes, exactly. So the point, however, is that European leaders are not as strong domestically, and they have limited bandwidth to give too much money at a time of economic distress, or even material. So that was point two. And point three they made was that they got the feeling that Volodymyr Zelenskyy was dead man walking because of the impressions of A, corruption, B, thin-skinned behavior, and C, the lack of support now from the US. So your views on all these three journalistic observations, which you might find very superficial, but I'd still love to learn what you think.
Well, yeah, on the sartorial crisis here, or issue, I thought, and I'm probably a poor one to opine on vestimentary diplomacy or whatever we would call it. I thought he handled it well, actually. It was clear whether it has any, because in Donald Trump was offended by the previous meeting, it would be legitimate to respond in some way to try to avoid some discord. And he took a sort of middle ground. He asserted, I think, his independence and integrity by not dressing like someone seeking a benediction from a don, a mafia don. But he did respond to the criticism. So in line with the statement that he has been making, which I think actually has been a substantive one, that this is a nation at war, besieged, invaded. I'm a wartime leader, and we must keep our focus on that. And I'm not a businessman or diplomat as usual going to clink goblets in a salon someplace, even if that's actually what I'm doing. So I thought that he handled that well, and that the Europeans are worked up about it. I frankly don't give a hoot about, because I think that they missed the point and are turning around in little circles on that issue, at least. I have to forget what the other one was because the closing issue
The other
was so
one
broad in my
was
mind.
the lack of political capital in European
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's very important, of course.
European
Well,
capitals.
there too, I mean, all of that is true. All of the Western nations or the rich countries, with the exception probably of Japan or some other countries in Asia, are struggling with the consequences, frankly, of cultural destabilization due to modernization and immigration from more poorer countries. That's the fundamental. Um, that's the underpinning of all of the crisis in England, in France, in Germany, in Holland, in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, in all of them. So from that view, and no one who ever has heard me say one word will think for a second that I am a supporter of Nigel Farage or Donald Trump. But their response to what is perceived by a significant segment of their own societies as a social crisis, even an existential one, is a rational response, and they are responding to perceived problems. Thus, Europe is struggling with the same things that have given us a fascist and are destroying progressively American democracy. But that's life in the big city. That's also democracy, and the leaders are the leaders until they aren't, and they have to do their jobs as best they can see it. And their job, as they all see it, is to keep Ukraine independent and able to seek its own destiny, which means growing ever closer to the West as opposed to the hordes from the East, and they will do so. And it's not a foregone conclusion that fascism, in whatever manifestation it takes in these countries, will triumph. So those are real crises, those are political issues, but that's the situation of the land, and that's how it goes. For now, they are able, haltingly, to respond. And yeah, money is tight and budgets are in deficit, and all these things are true. They're almost always true. But the wealthiest countries in the world, with the most capable militaries in the world, even if their budgets have been adequate for decades, can respond if they organize themselves enough to do it. It can respond effectively.
And the third point was about Volodymyr Zelenskyy being the fall guy now.
Well, that I don't know Ukrainian domestic politics well, but that I'm hearing this. I'm starting to read the tea leaves in a similar way. All politicians have they wear out, just as an intelligence officer's cover. However good you try to make it, it will erode. It just, over time, bright people figure out that I'm a spy, and that's, you cannot stop that. And Winston Churchill saved the empire and saved Great Britain, and was resoundingly tossed on his ear, within weeks. So it may be that Zelensky's time is approaching. I personally hope not. But if I were Ukrainian, perhaps I would feel differently, because it's a pluralistic society.
A Gallup poll found that 69% of them now want some sort of peace, ceasefire, end to fighting. Over to you, Gary. You've been waiting.
Hold on. Before I have to jump in on that. I thought that was one of the most garbage bits of news, frankly, I'll speak undiplomatically, I've ever heard. That's like saying, do you believe in apple pie and motherhood? And people will say yes. And they say, well, do you want your mother to spank you? And the answer will be, well, no. And both things are simultaneously true. They're both simultaneously true. Of course they want a negotiated settlement. But that's like saying, we all want to be rich, but I don't want taxes. Give me services and no taxes. It's no deeper than that. Because at the same time, I think 80% or 79% of Ukrainians say no territorial concessions, and we have to throw those bloody Russians out. So you think
the Gallup poll was a bit like Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes, Prime Minister?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. I mean, it's easy to say, I strongly support peace, and you can go to any country, go to anyone in any country, and ask that very same question. And of course, they're going to respond that way until you ask them, okay, now here is what the conditions of that peace might be. And you start going down the checklist for the Ukrainians, as Glenn pointed out, territorial concessions, depending. There's some nuance there, but for the most part, they draw a pretty firm line on what they're willing to concede. And security guarantees, Ukrainians desperately want those because they know that the only language that Vladimir Putin understands is power. They don't have it. NATO, and especially the United States, do. And therefore, they must have that. And if you tell them peace without that, then they're going to say no. That's not the peace they want. And so conditions matter. Just to follow up on Glenn's excellent points here, yes, all the European leaders are facing domestic political issues. That is the nature of politics in any democracy. The moment you take office, your polling starts to fall, almost all the time, with a few exceptions. But I think what is noteworthy is that not only these leaders, but most of their publics realize the critical importance of standing behind Ukraine. It's telling that Giorgia Meloni, who was, before her election, was never a big fan of support for Ukraine. She was pretty mealy-mouthed about it during her campaign. Subsequently, she got religion. I won't say that she's the strongest advocate, but she's there with the rest of them, and she was there.
She's had a Damascene conversion.
Yes. And I think there is this realization, not only that Ukraine must be defended, but also, and especially important for them, we have to keep the Americans close. They simply cannot allow the Americans, now in the guise of Donald Trump, to run loose and leave the reservation, i.e. NATO. And therefore, we have to be there en masse to demonstrate this. And so despite their domestic political weakness, I think they all reflected the interest and the will of their publics on these issues: Ukraine and its defense, and keeping the Americans within NATO, and hopefully tying the two together and whatever ultimate resolution may be reached. And so I don't attribute a whole lot of weight to it. It's not unimportant, but I don't think it's critically important. Although we could certainly see any one of these leave office prematurely, particularly Keir Starmer.
Disaster is always possible.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So,
and I don't want to sound like let people imagine that I am anti-democratic, an opponent of democracy, but democracies are always as follows, and therefore free media is always is exercised about the issue that you raised, Atul, which is, oh my God, people are in favor of peace, so we have to have peace, but they don't want to remove our troops, and so what do we do? I learned my first lessons from my father, who was involved in local politics. He was the chairman of my town's school committee. 70% of a town's budget normally goes to education, so it's a significant thing locally. And he said to me, he was always under pressure, you're spending much too much money. Big surprise, we have to lower taxes. And he says, well, okay, if that's what the will of the people is, we'll lower taxes. Which schools should we close? What sports team should we stop paying for? What teachers do you want to get rid of? Should we stop having music? Should we increase class size from 20 to 40 people? Okay, you have to make your choices. Which do we want? Well, we can't do any of those things. That's all terrible. So, and everyone was dissatisfied with a politician who doesn't square that circle. And that's the same issue that at a national, international, global level, that Macron and Meloni and all of the leaders are dealing with. So I don't have much respect, frankly, pardon me, this sounds terrible, for polling about popular opinion. In 1983, when I started my career, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, had spent 18 months with El Salvador as the number 1 foreign policy issue of the United States. And he went out and hammered the public for 18 months that there were commies only 90 miles, 90 minutes, and 90, whatever the heck it was, just across our border in El Salvador, and we had to stop this. And a large majority of the population of the United States said, well, this is absolutely, oh my God, there are commies just across our border. We have to do something, but we must not give any money or send any troops or do anything. And where is El Salvador? Because a larger majority still literally did not know, could not find El Salvador on a map. Americans aren't particularly stupid. Americans are people. That's the same thing that's happening with public opinions and the crises that all democratic leaders have to face with their electorates.
And a smart, clever politician could use this issue. Now, they've got so many other issues. The other big one pending out there is all the money that these governments are going to have to spend now on national security, which they did not have to do. And we can thank Donald Trump for bringing the heat on that issue and seeing the Europeans finally ponying up their share of European defense.
5%, as they've promised, 5% of GDP.
Yes, 5%. Now, Meloni, by the way, I just was reading this here. She's going to build this bridge to connect finally the Italy proper to the island of Sicily, which many Sicilians oppose, and she has rationalized this as part of their responsibility to defend Europe, and that this is a traffic thoroughfare that NATO could use in a crisis. Okay, it's a stretch. I don't know what it is. It's a 3-4 kilometer stretch, but she's trying to do it. So
Benito Mussolini would be proud of her.
Oh yes, he most definitely would, and it's going to be a beautiful bridge. And papers
big
are carrying
beautiful
all
bridge.
sorts of sketches of it, and so
one
forth.
big beautiful bridge.
But it's an example of the sort of political issues that all politicians in a democracy must juggle, while the populace sits in the bleachers there and is crowing about it and complaining and throwing tomatoes and doing all the other things that one does in a democracy. To get back to the relevant point here, vis-a-vis Ukraine and Zelenskyy, the critical recognition they all share. There's unanimity here, and you don't see that very often in Europe, is the importance of defending Ukraine and its sovereignty, and themselves, by extension, and the importance of keeping the United States part of the greater North Atlantic community, i.e. NATO, and actively participating, leading, which means finding ways to mollify Donald Trump when it's necessary. So they are all praising Donald Trump. I mean, Metz, I was kind of surprised because he was hardcore. Macron, too, on the ceasefire. They came out of that meeting praising it, says not only did it meet all of my expectations, it exceeded them. I'm not sure that's totally true, but he understands the need to say that to keep Donald Trump on board. The problem coming out of Washington is that if you look at the issues that are addressed, the tripartite summit, the ceasefire versus a peace agreement, security guarantees, and territory, not a lot of details, not much at all. And why is that? And that's because they weren't discussed, and that's going to require an extraordinary amount of negotiation. Those are hardcore, difficult issues for which the Trump team, negotiating team, who aside from Witkoff remain a mystery to me, are going to have to sit down first among themselves and decide what the boss may or may not accept, and then sit down across from the Russians and the Ukrainians. That's not something that's going to be done on the quick. I can tell you right now. Nothing.
They have no idea.
No idea. I have to say I'm worried about as I said earlier, the lack of heft on the part of the Trump negotiating team. I hope that changes.
Well, oh God.
They need some substantive expertise, and you only find that, Trump doesn't like to hear this, but he's going to have to, among the career public servants from the State Department, and of course military as well, Defense Department, and the CIA, and maybe a few other agencies as well.
Two-thirds of whom now are bagging groceries in McLean, Virginia, because they've been released from government service. But this is the crisis that you have. This is literally the case. This what happened to me, and Gary, you will identify with this, I'm certain. Exponentially. I was one time briefing a senior political figure on a problem in the Middle East. And so I think Atul knows this tale. So I said, well, the issue in Lebanon is, it's very complex. There are the Shia this, and then there are the Druze that, and then there are the Christians the other thing. And then there's pressure from Syria, and of course the Israeli and the IDF and Mossad, they're all at odds with one another, but they occupy half the country and blow up the other third periodically. And so it's really complex, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer to me was, and I will not use the expletive deleted, it was, Glenn, this is not a graduate school seminar. F the detail, find me the effing communists, terrorists. That was it. There was no interest or even capability to understand the critical nuance, because we know where the devil is in the details, but there was no care about that whatsoever. Now, on the other hand, also relevant, I have tremendous sympathy for our political leaders, because a solid citizen in somewhere in the middle of the United States or central France, or you choose the country, who wants to be engaged and do the right thing and support the government to advance his or her own country's national interests, has a full-time job and then has a family and has other interests and so on. And so, my job is to be a dentist or a philosopher. I don't work where Gary Grappo does in the Middle East or Glenn Carle does in Europe. And I don't spend all my energies on that. At the end of the day, I'm pretty tired. So how do I make my decision? And can I really be expected to have an informed opinion on what the United States policy should be towards Nagorno-Karabakh? Where is that? Now, people don't know, but they should, and this is why our political leaders are important, that in all the time that we've been giving Russia a pass under Donald Trump, and before, frankly, what has Russia been doing? They have twice tried to assassinate the prime minister of Montenegro. Who knows where Montenegro is? They have occupied part of Azerbaijan and Armenia. They have destabilized and started to subsume, at least in influence, Georgia. They are doing the same thing in Moldova, because I forget which of the Baltic states it was. I think Estonia moved a Russian, this is literally true, a Russian statue. The Russian intelligence service had a cyber attacked the entire country and shut down its electrical grid in the entire country. They have invaded, they occupied and stole Crimea, which is a huge area, and they've invaded Ukraine and killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, taken 20% of the country, and kidnapped dozens of thousands of Ukrainian children, with no one really paying particular attention except to say peace is good and why are we involved there? Well, we should be, and that's on our leaders, because the average citizen can't fairly be expected to understand all of that in real time.
Yeah, like I said, I'm only slightly, maybe microscopically, more sanguine after the summit in Washington than after the summit in Alaska, and I'm hoping that Zelenskyy and the European leaders manage to persuade Trump. It's unclear, and even if they did, Today, he may be on a different page, but of the critical importance of the viability of Ukraine and Ukraine's security and how much the rest of Europe depends on Ukraine's security. And it starts, I think, with security guarantees. It's also critically important on how they determine the territory, the territorial distribution of areas that the Russians currently control versus those they claim. And there is a difference, and it's a very significant difference, not in terms of necessarily an area, but where it is and what that specific area they do not control but claim fits in to the economic and security picture in Ukraine. It's very important, and you can't just pass your hand over that. I'm glad that Glenn mentioned, I think it's between 20 and 25,000 Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped and brought to Russia. Some have already been placed inside Russian families, Russian orphanages. They're getting a Russian education. I mean, who are these children going to be if they remain in Russia? They're going to be Russian, but potential enemies of their genuine homeland, which is Ukraine. There ought to be clear insistence that they all be repatriated. And kudos to Melania Trump for sending the letter calling this out. And if nothing else, it has placed this issue on Trump's radar, and I hope he pursues it, because it does, and it's a manifestation, I think, more than, well, I can't say more than anything else, but it's something that people can truly respond to of the level of cruelty that Putin has inflicted on the country of Ukraine. And yet, the people of Ukraine, their armed forces, the men and women in their armed forces, remain committed to defending their country. It says something to the character of Ukrainians, and we ought to applaud that and support it.
So, two quick questions for you. So, one pertains to, and as Glenn pointed out, domestic politics is low information, low interest. One pertains to the other element of the population. One, of course, Glenn referred to the drift to the right, but the other element of the population, let's say the percentage of Muslims in France or Germany, of Arab or Turkish or Pakistani or Bangladeshi origin when it comes to the UK. So let's go to UK, Netherlands, France, Germany in particular. These four nations, significant Muslim populations, and they do not support the war in Ukraine. And they have Labour voters. And Labour is under tremendous pressure because they say, look, you're not supporting our brothers in Gaza because they are brown and they are Muslim. Instead, you care about Ukrainians because they are white and they are Christian. And this is a great source of tension for Labour MPs, some of whom are my friends. And they say, look, we are under tremendous strain because domestically, it's not like World War II, where the country rallied under Churchill and responded to stirring speeches. So because immigration and religion has been, as Glenn and I have discussed, been a dividing line even between Protestants and Catholics. One of you is Catholic and the other comes from a Protestant background. And you're perfectly amicable with each other, but go back to 1618 and Protestants and Catholics were slaughtering each other in Europe. So religion and race is a fault line, and the support is not as strong for Keir Starmer, or for that matter, MERS, even amongst the non-right electorate. So that's one. How do you deal with that? And number two, and this is important, is because I meet members of the administration, I meet Republicans on Capitol Hill, I meet members of the Trump administration even, and they keep talking in disparaging terms about Europeans, that their economy is in the toilet, that they may be polished, but they have no vigor, that they are men without chess, that it is America that spends on Europe's security and it's America that is keeping Ukraine aloft. And so given, one, the domestic pressures on European leaders, not just from the right, but also from the left and Gaza, and the pressures thanks to Gaza, the internal pressures, and also the zeitgeist in Washington, D.C., in the new Republican Party, what transpires next? And that is the final section of our FO Live, of this discussion. What comes next?
Well, what comes next is I think Trump is probably, for some reason, he is really attached to this trilateral summit. And I think he's going to turn up the pressure, but I don't think he's going to actually do anything about it, but turn up the pressure on Putin to get this done, this three-way meeting. I know Putin does not want to do it. He doesn't even want to have a bilateral with Zelenskyy. So I think it's going to be a stretch to get the trilateral, but perhaps just the opposite. Trump there will make it somewhat different for him. But without increased pressure from the United States, whether it's sanctions or something else, whether it's, in my view, going to Congress and say, you need to wrap up that bill for the provision of X billion dollars more in assistance to Ukraine, which would change very definitely Putin's perception of the situation, probably more than anything else. If the United States were to step up with a package of $50 to $80 billion of additional aid for Ukraine, Putin would take notice because his economy is also suffering. He has a domestic base. How he mollifies them is with an economy which is stretched thin at the moment. It's a militarized economy. Militarized economies don't last. It's a sugar high. And that economy has been on a sugar high with increased military spending for the last 3 years. It's not going to last. And inflation figures show that. And so he has domestic pressures too. We can't ignore it. I'm not in a position to give political advice to any of these people about their domestic problems. They got theirs. America has ours. And accomplished politicians in a democracy deal with it. Not always in a necessarily attractive way, but they find ways to deal with it. And the good ones, the ones who will succeed, will. And the ones who don't, well, they'll be replaced by someone who's a bit better or not. But nevertheless, I'm not even going to get into that because what is critically important for purposes of this conversation is what do the parties, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the Europeans writ large, what do they do next on the problem of Ukraine and the security threat that it presents to the country of Ukraine, obviously, but also to all of Europe, and to the longer-term security interests of the United States. If we're not there for this issue, then you might as well package up NATO in a really neat box with a very pretty ribbon and put it on the shelf. And this is a really determining period of time for NATO. And in order for this to succeed, they're going to have to keep Donald Trump engaged. They succeeded in doing that. And we got to take that for what it's worth. Granted, it's a little iffy. It's not certain. It's a moving target, not referring to the target that Glenn described earlier on in terms of how a case officer in the intelligence world works. He's very much a moving target, but they came away with something, that Donald Trump is still part of this, still seems to be engaged. And look, if he wants that Nobel Prize, he's going to have to work for it. And working for it means delivering an agreement, starting maybe with a ceasefire, but maybe not, that addresses the needs of Ukraine satisfactorily. That's going to be critical, and that the Europeans can accept as well. I suspect that Trump will accept whatever they accept. Russia is certainly not going to take anything that doesn't meet their de minimis criteria. They're simply not. What that is, we don't know, because at the moment, and this is really important for the viewers of the podcast to understand, is that in terms of public statements by the Kremlin, by Putin himself, by his foreign minister, defense minister, national security advisor, spokespeople, armed forces, has not changed an iota. They still argue for the same thing, all of it, all of these historic root causes, et cetera, et cetera. They've been saying that since the day of the invasion. And it's because their ambitions remain all of Ukraine. And until that changes, and it can change with significant pressure, particularly from the United States, Europe and certainly Ukraine face a challenge. And it has not been resolved yet after Alaska, most definitely, and not after the meeting yesterday in Washington.
I'm glad you raised this issue. I've come out of the last two meetings with more, I don't want to say optimism, but seeing a way forward that I didn't before with regard to U.S. involvement with Ukraine and the war and with NATO. And it wasn't from anything that came out of the summit in the Oval Office yesterday, but from statements from the White House in the day or two prior, which was that, the U.S. will provide weapons and money and material and so on to NATO or to whomever wants to buy it, and they can sell it to Ukraine. And I see this as the way forward for Ukraine and for Donald Trump to remain true to his inclinations, which is hostility to Zelenskyy and Ukraine, and friendship for Russia, or Putin specifically, he doesn't care about Russia, without utterly repudiating his positions, and thus, and really not even having to take any stand in particular. So he would think, because I'm not supporting Zelenskyy. Europeans can do what they want, and the Europeans have the money if they have the will to buy all the patriots that Zelenskyy could need. So I see that as the likely way forward, because I totally agree with Gary that Putin is a consistent person with with clear objectives that he's pursued for his whole life as a national leader, and he will continue to do so. So there are two options. One, Ukraine fails from lack of support, or Ukraine is sustained, and then Putin either will have to stop in abeyance, hold things in abeyance, or will lose. And that depends on European and U.S. aid. And I do see, I think the most likely way forward is this, we'll sell stuff to the Dutch, who will then give it to the Ukrainians.
Well, those of you who've listened so far should read a piece that Glenn and I have written on Vladimir Putin's long game. We even did a podcast in the early days of the dialectic on Vladimir Putin's long game. We analyze his long-term national security strategy, foreign policy, yada yada. And the link will be below. We've had a fantastic discussion here. I thank both gentlemen for making the time. And we will be back to discuss many other issues, many other times. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. And from Atul Singh, Glenn Carle, and Gary Grappo, it's bye for now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.